Tonight we have Bruce Henderson here to speak about his book, Midnight Flyboys. This is really an excellently written book, first of all. And the stories he tells are rather stunning. Those of you, we read about wars, from these really big points of view, and so many people were involved. And, when you read that 20 million Russians died, and it's such an overwhelming amount of destruction and everything. It reminds me that people forget real easily what that was like on an individual basis, and Bruce has made it come alive for a lot of people. But I remember thinking, at the time of the 9/11, that right away people were saying this is unprecedented and everything, this destruction of life and so on and so forth, all in one day. And I thought, okay, between 1939, September of 39, and September of 1945, when the war in Japan was finally over, more people died every single day for 6 years in a row than died on 9/11. Yeah. That's what it was like. And I think we need to remember that, because a lot of people think this was the greatest generation. Some of the things they did were so amazing and stuff like that. But basically what they did, there's some more seats over here. But basically what they did was they had plenty of experience of how bad things can get, and therefore they compromised with each other. Compromise was not considered bad, but the art of politics, basically. And so a lot of things got done, and things seemed, there were all kinds of problems during the 50s and 60s, obviously, but a lot got done, and people talked to each other still. Anyway, I hope we don't have to go through as bad a time in order to be able to learn how to compromise again. It doesn't seem like you should be able to read about this and know how to do it rather than this. And now, somebody that can make that come alive for what that was really like for people, it's really, really valuable. So I want to thank Bruce for doing that, because he makes this come alive in the lives of so many individuals to stand in for the big picture. So thanks a lot, Bruce, for coming and talking to us.
Thank you, George.
My first question is, where did you uncovered so many personal facts about people, and I read in your acknowledgments there was a guy named Tom Emlinson or something like that who had collected a lot of things because of his father, and you yourself mentioned that your uncle was involved in this group, right?
Right. Well, no, my uncle was a fighter pilot, but wasn't in this group.
Oh,
But I found my uncle's suitcase in my grandmother's closet when I was about 10 or 12, and it had all of his pilot paraphernalia. He never came back. He was lost in the war, and I really became interested in pilots in general. And what I found in researching this book was that a lot of other folks have found suitcases or boxes in the attic or in the basement that belonged to their grandfather or uncle or their father. And so I always reach out to, because a lot of them, unfortunately, the vets now are passed, have gone. I mean, there's 40,000 World War II veterans left out of the 16 million who served in the war. And it's 4 or 5 books ago, I'd go to their cities. I would get to meet them. I'd be with them for 3 or 4 days, interviewing them, breaking bread with them. And fewer are now alive. And for this book, there were only 3 fellows alive. But I reach out to the families. I try to get as much as I can in terms of correspondence, journals. Of course, go to the archives and get the official reports. But that really, for me, it's fine. I have to do that, but I'm not writing an encyclopedia. I'm trying to bring this story to life in a way that is called narrative nonfiction. It should read like a novel, but it's all true, and that's how to research it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, one of the things that you talk about, which surprises some people, is that there were women spies involved as well, and women parachutists that would parachute behind the lines, and. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? You have 2 great characters who we'll go to individually as well. But how did that decision get made? Because this is in the middle of World War II. You think, we're not going to send women behind the lines into a bunch of guys living in the forest in France, right?
Right.
That's a tough assignment.
I tell you, I've written 5 or 6 World War II books now, and I've always liked to get women characters into the story. But it's difficult because they weren't combatants then like they are today. However, I found in this story there were plenty of women combatants who were being recruited for their language skills. In this case, they were either born in France or were raised in France for a period of time, got out of there before the Germans invaded, and they could speak native French. And it wasn't like learning French in college or anything like that. They had the skills of a native speaker. And so the intelligence services, both British and the U.S., were recruiting them. And why women? Well, women, once they were on the ground in France, could be really effective couriers. Young women on a bicycle going from one village to another with important messages were less suspicious to the German sentries than a guy or a couple of guys doing it. So they really recruited them for that purpose. But these women were amazing. I mean, they put parachutes on and dropped out of these airplanes at low altitudes, and there were about 50 that did it over France, and about 400 male agents went out as well too, and 13 of the women were killed in the war.
So we'll go into the detail on two of the women, Nancy Wake and Violet Szabo. But that was a big picture thing that I thought was interesting. Another thing you talked about, which a lot of people are aware of as part of World War II, was how quickly France folded. When they were attacked, they thought that this would be we'll be able to push it back the way it was in World War I, but it didn't work that way at all. And you had just one little line in your book saying that 2 million French prisoners of war were taken at the beginning of after the Germans moved forward into France and took it over. 2 million men moved out of France and into Germany as prisoners of war. And this was 1940.
1940 before.
And so they stayed there for 5 years working in prison camps or whatever.
And a good number of them never made it back because they were worked to death.
Yeah.
But the Germans put them to work mostly in Germany, forced labor. France folded fairly quickly, but not for trying. And certainly the French people, most of them, a great majority of them, wanted to see their country free again and liberated, and were willing to pay the price if they had to make that happen.
Yeah. Yeah, the cooperation part of the story is also very amazing. Okay, so the idea was come up with. How far before D-Day? They realized that they wanted to do some work before D-Day, but it was pretty far in preparation.
The timeline is about late 1943. Of course, Eisenhower and his brass knew that they were going to be invading the coast of France into the next year. And that's 6 or 7 months, 8 months before they did that. It was really important, Eisenhower felt, to strengthen the French resistance. And how are they going to do that? Well, they needed to get supplies to them. In 1941, after Germany had already taken over France, the British, before we were in the war, started setting up these networks of resistance networks in France. And they were dropping agents in much earlier than we were, not as many as we did in that 6 or 7 month period. But they already had these networks set up. And Eisenhower realized that we needed to have more airplanes flying more missions every night to drop as much material. We're talking ammunition, guns, bicycle tires, and also these agents into France, and with radios and all of this had to come together. He felt before D-Day, and it did. And
you tell the story about how the first recruits were brought in and what they were told and what happened. I thought that was kind of, because they didn't know what was going on, right?
Yeah, the fellows that flew the B-24 Liberators, and by the way, that's a plane that was not meant to fly these kinds of missions, which were low, slow at night, and Solo. These planes were meant to fly high altitude, big formations, strategic bombing, which many of them were B-17s and B-24s. But there were 3 squadrons of these B-24s that were doing anti-submarine patrols off the Bay of Biscay, off of Spain. There were a lot of U-boats coming in and out. And they were used to flying low over the ocean, solo missions. And so when this decision was made in the late fall of 43 that we needed to get some planes that could make these drop missions over France, they said, who do we have? Well, if we pull the guys out of the high altitude strategic bombing, they're not going to really know how to fly these planes. Like, oh, we have these guys doing these anti-submarine patrols. Let's bring them in. So they brought 3 squadrons, and that would be about 120 pilots. And they got them in the room. And the first group they allowed to either leave or not leave. And they gave them a 5-minute cautionary briefing. Not a lot of details, except you're going to learn to fly the plane in ways you never have. It's going to be dangerous. And you're going to learn to do it by yourself. You have to navigate by yourself. The big formations would, of course, fly the lead plane. So there'd be maybe 200 planes doing the strategic bombing. But these guys were going in by themselves. Each and every plane, every navigator would have to get his plane to the dark field where these resistance forces were waiting. Well, anyway, at the end of this 5-minute, again, no real details about what they were going to do, except it was going to be dangerous. Now, if anybody wants to leave, you've got 5 minutes here, and you can walk out and you'll be reassigned. And there were pilots with their entire crews there. And they all sat there, and everybody was looking at everybody. And I talked to one of the guys afterwards, and he said, nobody got up and left. But we always thought later, if one person had, maybe some of the others would have. And certainly if one of the pilots had gotten up, his co-pilot would have gotten up, and his navigator, and probably, anyway, they all stayed, and that's how they got into it. When they started having replacements come in, they weren't given the option of volunteering or not, but it was really a small group. They were operationally about 40 to 50 B-24s were flying every night to different places in France for their parachuting missions.
They went even all the way to the south of France.
All the way to the south of France and all the way to the east. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons the B-24 was selected over the B-17, because it had longer range and it was faster and all of that.
We say it was dangerous, or you say it was dangerous. Now, how many people were involved over the next year and a half or so? Were done for
90% of this stuff was basically done when France was liberated in September.
So less than a year then.
Yeah, less than a year.
And during that less than a year, how many missions flown? And
there were something like 2,500 mission sorties, they called them, and they delivered 10 million pounds of supplies and about several hundred agents, spies. As well. They would usually drop 2 to 3 spies on each mission. And then, of course, they had these big, well, there's some photos I can show you, but they had these torpedo-like steel cylinders that they could put 300 pounds of supplies in, ammunition, guns, whatever, and they had 12 of them in the bomb bay of this B-24. The B-24s were not going to drop bombs. In their bomb bays were the containers with all of the supplies. Well, they would go down to about 400 feet and drop them into this darkened field, which somebody would be down there with a light giving the right codes, so they would do this. And then the plane would go up to 600 feet, and out of a hole in the bottom of the plane, they would drop the parachutists down. Well, I don't know, 600 feet meant that they weren't wearing any reserve chutes. There wouldn't have been time. If their chute didn't open, they would be dead. And so they're going down in the dark. And then the plane is trying to get out of there without being spotted by German night fighters or anti-aircraft guns.
And they had, one of the things I found interesting in detail was that they had maps that they had developed because of the spies that were already there, that back in England, they kind of knew where most of the anti-aircraft placements were and all that ahead of time. And that was all mapped, and the navigator on board was supposed to make sure that they didn't get too close to any of that.
Yeah, even where they came in over the coast. You know, if there's a known gun placement, or if there's a German airfield, they're not going to fly over it. So they're going to find a different route in. But just the navigation of this, and I go into it a little bit because it's just amazing to me that every plane had this navigator who had to, first of all, he's in the nose of the plane, but he's not looking out. His back is to the nose, and he's got a little curtain over him. He's got a little light, and he's got his maps. And he's using his compass, and he's using the speed of the aircraft, and he's using sometimes celestial navigation, sometimes radio navigation, although it wasn't anywhere near what it is today, and trying to bring that plane over to that little field where these partisans are going to be waiting, and just to get there. Now, not every plane made every successful mission every time, but it was about 85% of the flights that were going out were dropping where they needed to drop. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, and you said that the partisans on the ground would have a signal. And that they had some kind of Morse code signal set up in advance and stuff like that.
Right.
If that wasn't correct, then they weren't supposed to drop.
Then they were supposed to come back with the supplies.
Yeah.
Sometimes the Germans had gotten a hold of the radio and the codes and had put in the signal to drop your supplies and your agents here. And in some cases, they did right into the lap of Gestapo. And of course, when the agents landed, they were taken prisoner.
Yeah. So out of this group of people that did this work, what percentage survived the war? Was it?
Well, of the aviators, they lost. Again, they started with about 120 pilots, and they lost. But you have to include replacement pilots that came in too. They lost about 80.
80.
And they lost about 40 or 45 aircraft went down. Some of the aircraft that went down, of course, not everybody on it. I mean, some of them survived. And they either bailed out or whatever. And that's what I want to do. What I set out to do in this book was not only tell the story of this, you know, the guys flying there and dropping these supplies and these agents, but I wanted to know what happened to not only that stuff that they dropped, but the agents that they dropped, and what's the rest of the story there. So we follow some of those characters, some of those agents, and including a couple of the women who are amazing stories.
Yeah. So do you have pictures you want to show? Yeah.
Let's do this. Okay, well, there you go. That's a little advertisement. Okay, here's France. Now, there were about 100 resistance networks set up, most of them, as I say, by the British, although some by the OSS, which was the United States Intelligence Service. But about 100 in the Western European countries, but something like 60 in France alone. And they were all over. So you can see where the United Kingdom is up there. Some of those flights would go all the way to the south, and they would be, 10 hours in the air. I mean, and they were always leaving at, the reason it's called Midnight Flyboys is they were always leaving about 10 o'clock at night. In the beginning, they were using moonlight to help them find the fields. But then, of course, what happened was about 10 days out of the month, there's no moonlight. So they grounded them at the first month, and it was like, they think, no, we have to fly every night. So they ended up going up in very dark nights flying too. But here's one of the planes that, and they were painted a matte black so that they couldn't be easily spotted in the sky. Here's a cockpit of a B-24, and this is pretty amazing because this airplane was described by some of the pilots as like flying a garbage truck. It took a lot of muscle, and nothing was real sophisticated, as you can see. And most of the pilots were pretty big guys who flew these bombers. I mean, muscular, long legs, and all of that. Whereas the fighter pilots who were in the smaller cockpits tended to be smaller guys. They're not going to be a 6'1" fighter pilot because you're not going to be able to get in the cockpit. The thing to keep in mind here, though, is this plane, these B-24s, were being flown by women air service pilots, the WASPs, ferried from factories domestically here to bases in the United States. So qualified women flew these planes too, but they were not easy. And here's an artist's rendition, if you will, of what one of the flights would be. Again, one plane alone, finding a field, in this case with moonlight, and parachuting both supplies and agents. Now, these are the torpedo, if you will, shaped cylinders that they would open up, and they had shopping lists like a network in 20 miles south of Paris would say, we need 2 bicycle tires for our couriers. We need ammunition for submachine guns. We need blah, blah, blah. And they had shopping lists. And then they labeled these containers to make sure it got in the right plane and that the plane went to the right field where this particular group of partisans were waiting. And they were loading these. Okay, and then here we are again.
Who was the quartermaster in charge of all that? Because that's a really big business.
It is. It was amazing.
He eventually founded Amazon, I think.
Yeah, probably. Each of those big cylinders had a parachute on it, and so there you go. They're dropping 12 of them all at once out of the bomb bay. Here's one of the crews I followed. Again, I wanted to follow. This is a crew that went down. Although they all lived, and it was the Simon crew. And what was very interesting about this, they made their drop and then they got hit by an enemy night fighter, and they were on fire. And the pilot, who's Murray Simon, back row, far right, he stayed at the controls long enough for all the other guys to parachute out, and that's what the bomber pilots did in World War II. That was the ethos, if you will. They were there as long as they had to be for the rest of the crew to get out. And he was the last one out, and he was also able to parachute out. But what's interesting is they all landed, middle of the night again. They never ran into another crew member after they landed on the ground. They all had a different journey. A couple of them were captured. Several of them escaped. One of them, who we'll talk a little bit more about, joined the resistance. Mm-hmm. This is the pilot, Murray Simon.
It's interesting, and here's his brother. I wanted to make sure that you brought that up because his brother had a similar outrageous experience in the Pacific at the same time.
Yeah, in the same kind of plane, B-24. And the mom, Anna Simon in New York City, poor thing, gets a telegram on both of her sons about 3 weeks apart saying they're missing in action. Mm-hmm. So Murray's on the left and his brother Sidney's on the right, and Sidney was a navigator in the B-24. He ended up crashing in the Pacific, but was recovered. She got both of her sons back. And Murray was the first one to link up with the resistance, and they got him on an escape route over the Pyrenees and ended up getting back to England. And he found himself the first one of his crew who had returned. Here's the crash site of the Simon plane once it hit. And those are some French kids going through the wreckage the next day. Mm-hmm. This is also one of the Simon crew, Graham Hasty, who was the tail gunner on the B-24. And again, that has a machine gun in the back and the tail of the plane, which is a good defensive weapon if the enemy's coming up from behind. Also kind of a bad place to be if the enemy plane's coming up from behind. And in fact, I found out that tail gunners in the Army Air Forces in World War II had the highest casualty rate. They were the ones most likely to get wounded or killed. He got out, but he ended up becoming a prisoner of war, and we follow. Whoops, I went back. We follow him a little bit. He's actually being escorted through Frankfurt. This is Frankfurt, what it looks like in 1944. I'm not sure how much detail you can see, but it's basically leveled. I mean, the buildings that are there are shells. And 3 German soldiers are escorting him and about 10 other American POWs through the town, walking through the town to go to the train station, and they were going to be then taken to a prisoner of war camp. And they were set upon by some very angry citizens of Frankfurt who, looked at these airmen coming through and, boy, you're the one who's destroyed our city. And the German soldiers actually leveled their guns at them and made the civilians back off, and they protected the Americans and got them on the train and got them in the POW camp. I want to mention when our airmen went down and went into a POW camp. Those camps were run by the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, and not the Gestapo, not the SS. And the Luftwaffe knew that they were going to lose. They were losing their guys who were becoming our prisoners. And of course, Germany had signed the Geneva Convention about the proper treatment of prisoners. But they wanted their pilots to be treated well too when they became prisoners. So the Luftwaffe, it's not like it was a summer camp. The food was horrible and not much of it. And it was still loss of freedom behind barbed wire, but it was better than being in a camp run by the SS or the Gestapo. This is also a member of the Simon crew, John Meade. He's the one that went down and connected with the resistance guys on the ground, and they were going to arrange for him to escape over the Pyrenees, but the resistance leader locally there said, I'm kind of short-handed. Would you mind staying and helping me? You could really help us bring in some of, these drops and stuff. And John said, well, I'd be happy to, but I don't want to be a deserter. We're going to have to send a radio message to London to see if I can do this. So they did, and about a week later, they got a message back from London saying, you can keep him, and they had his service number. So he became the only member of the Carpetbaggers to be officially reassigned to the French resistance, and ended up being awarded not 1 but 2 Silver Stars for what he did over the next couple of months. And that's part of the story. Should we just keep going?
Sure.
Okay, this is called the dressing hut, and the woman on the left and then the man next to her are both agents that are being prepared to go on the plane. And what they did, they just basically started from the skin outward. Everything they wore had to have the right labels in it, had to have the right things in the pocket, no English cigarettes. They gave them false ID, and they even had pictures of their supposed family in the wallet. And so they put the jumpsuits over that civilian clothing, but they were very careful what they went in with in case they were questioned. And here's the hole in the bottom of the fuselage, and it was they took out the belly turret, the gun turret, if you will, and had this hole that they then put a piece of plywood over and then when it was time for them to drop down, they'd open it up. It was called the Joe hole because these flyers did not know the real names of the agents. So if they were men, they were Joe, and if they were women, they were Josephine. They didn't call it the Josephine hole; they called it the Joe hole. But they went down through there, dropped into the.
You have a story about a guy who was right near the edge one time. Oh, you're going.
This is Nancy. She's the one who was.
Yeah, right.
Okay, Nancy Wake. An amazing story, and I'm not going to tell you much about it. I want you to enjoy it when you read it. Yeah. But her motivation was she was born in New Zealand, raised in Australia, went to England as a young woman. In the 30s, was a newspaper correspondent, and was assigned to Paris. And this is about mid-30s. And so when war broke out, when Germany invaded France, She was by then, she could speak the language. She was also married to a Frenchman and almost immediately became involved in the resistance. And she got so successful that the Gestapo put a bounty on her, and they were calling her the White Mouse because she was so hard to find. They didn't know who she was. They didn't have her real name or anything, but they were starting to close in on her, and she decided she had to get out of the country. And she did, went over the Pyrenees, went into England. Her husband was supposed to follow a couple of weeks later, and he never did. She's in London waiting, wanting to be part of the war, gets recruited to go back and parachute back into France. And that's where I pick up the story with her. But as brave as she was, she had a lifetime fear of heights. So here she is in a plane. She's the last one to parachute out. There are 2 agents with her who have already gone out. And she's sitting there by the Joe hole, and the plane keeps going, and now it's too late. She can't go because they're over the field. And the dispatcher, who's the crewman who's in charge for getting the agents out on time, he said, "Ma'am, we can take you back to London. That's okay." And she's, no, let's do it again. But will you do me a favor and give me a shove? So he did. He gave her a shove at the right time. But that was about the last time she showed any timidity. One of the resistance leaders who she fought with said she was the most feminine woman he ever knew. But when it came to fighting, she fought like 5 men. And this is another woman agent that I follow. And I didn't really pick all the pretty ones, but she's Violet Sabot, and her motivation was her husband was in the French Foreign Legion and then became part of de Gaulle's Free French and ended up losing his life in North Africa fighting against the Germans. And she was seeking revenge. She wanted to kill as many Germans as she could, and volunteered to go in, and she made not just 1, but 2 parachute. And here she is here with her husband.
It was interesting that when they recruited her and they realized that her main motive was revenge, that gave them pause. Like
they worried about that because they didn't want her to be reckless. Mm-hmm. It's one thing, to maybe do something dumb about yourself for yourself, but it could cost the lives potentially of other agents, and they really wanted her. But she got through the training, and she's anyway. Here's the gold medal, which is the highest civilian award that Congress gives, and they gave it to the OSS and the Carpetbaggers in 2016. Here's one of the 3 Carpetbaggers who's still alive, Bill Becker, 99. In fact, I think he just turned 100. He was a tail gunner. Yeah, he lived. He survived. Mm-hmm. One of the tail gunners who survived. He so wanted to live long enough to get back to the D-Day anniversary last June that he put his suitcase out in the living room 6 months earlier just to remind himself he needed to live that long to get back there. And he made it. He went back on one of those veteran flights, and when he got off the plane and stepped foot on French soil, his quote was, "I made it." And there was a New York Times reporter there who took it down, and that became the New York Times did a front page coverage on the ceremony and the anniversary, and they had a picture of Bill Becker with his quote of the day, "I made it." There we go. That's the photos.
So let's go into a couple of details. There was a bike ride. I think you tell them about the bike ride if you can.
Nancy Wake.
Nancy Wake, yeah.
Nancy Wake. These agents usually worked in teams of 3. One would be the radio operator, one would be the courier, and one would be called the organizer. She actually did both organizing and courier, but her main job was courier, getting messages back and forth to all of these different. Some of them were a couple hundred miles apart, and she had to do that. But the her radio operator thought he was going to be captured at one point, and he destroyed the radio and buried it and buried the codes and as they were trained. And then he wasn't captured, and he reported back to Nancy, and he said, I lost the radio. We don't have the radio. Well, without the radio, they couldn't get any messages to London about making drops to, that the resistance forces needed. And Nancy knew that they had to find another radio, but she had no idea where to do it. Somebody said, there was a radio operator 200 miles away in this town. And the only way she could get there, she couldn't be getting in a car because she'd be stopped. She had to do it by bike. So she actually did this bicycle ride, unbelievable bicycle ride, to get to the radio operator to have him send a message to London to please drop her group a new radio. And she rode back. And she was asked after the war what she was most proud of. And she said that bicycle ride. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty exhausted when she was done, but it was interesting that she could get through German lines and
again
was stopped all kinds of times, but she could speak French well, and therefore that helped. But
and she could bat her eyes. She actually took some train rides, and the German officers were, treating her, and nobody was hitting her up for ID because she was sitting next to this German officer who was, I guess, trying to get her phone number or something, and she'd come back and say, "Yes, I have a German colonel who's waiting for me to call him."
So. The organization of it. We want to talk about the two top guys and how they got in. I think Fish and the guys who organized the whole thing and how they did it. Go back to that part. Yeah.
They were the commanding officer of the Carpetbaggers. Well, they're. I don't know. I don't want to give too many details about them. I want them to read it. Okay. Okay.
Perfect.
I'm sorry.
Perfect. No, that's fair. All right. So we sit here, and we're trying to put ourselves in the place of these people. What things did you find out that surprised you, that how difficult? I mean, if you just think, one of the things you mentioned about Nancy was that when she became a leader, there were like 7,000 partisans under her leadership, something like that, right?
Several thousand.
So she, and this, we're talking about World War II. Not a lot of women leaders, having that, and these guys are the resistance.
Yeah.
They're not really organized, and they're living in a forest. We won't talk about the one incident of her leadership because that's really, really valuable to read because you really get the idea about what she had to put up with. But what did she have to go through to get that kind of respect? To do that?
Yeah, I mean, in fighting with all the men, she had to prove her that she could do it, and she did. But one thing I found with all of these characters, if you will. And even though I call them characters, and it sounds too much like a novel, they were all, of course, real life folks, but they all had a similar mission, and it was that they felt they had a job to do, and it had to be done. And then once it was done, they could go back to their lives. They could go back home. The flyers could go back home. The agents could find their family or their husband and resume their life. But that was a job. None of these folks were looking to be heroes. At least none of the ones that I wrote about. Not that I saw. And yet they became heroic in that they did their job, even though at times they were scared, and even though at times they were in tremendous peril, and because they had that motivation. And I just go back to what this country must have been like, in World War II. About 130 million people. Let's say half of them were adults, right? On general, half were kids, right? So that's 70 million adults, and 16 million of them were in the military. I mean, that's 1 in 5 or something. And then those that were still home, like my grandmother used to tell me about her victory garden. I mean, everybody was pulling in the same direction. And my God, do you see why I like living in World War II? And it was good against evil, and good won. And I've said this before about World War II, and I say it now with a little bit with some concern, but I think I say, what would the world have been like if good hadn't won? But then, then I look at, but they did it, and they that generation did it, and God bless them, and thank you for your service.
It was also amazing. I mean, some of the stuff that we don't rely on anymore for different reasons. But one of the things that you talked about when they were trying to pick out the people who would go, who would become part of the team, that they tested their character. It's like people don't test people's character too often. and it reminds me of early stories in business where people would pick out the people for their companies that they're trying to build based upon their character and giving them the job that they thought their character. And there's this confidence people had, some of the leaders, not everybody, of course, but some leaders had, that they could pick people out based on the character that they saw they had and put them in the right slot in order to make something productive. And everybody, of course, now uses algorithms and everything else so that if something goes wrong, you can say, well, it looked good on paper, And we don't pick out people that way too often. I mean, some young companies that are getting started do pick out people like that, but it's an interesting difference in timing.
I'm reminded of this story though. Toward the end of her training, Nancy Wake was a little concerned. She was wondering if she was going to get through and it was a very rigorous training, not only physically but in all kinds of ways. And she wasn't sure, that she was going to end up being graduating and qualifying and be deployed in the field. She was worried. And so one night she broke into the commander's office and read her file. And so she graduated, and in the following week she was sent to London to report for, she was going to be deployed. And the honcho guy there said, well, Nancy, you really had a very good record there. And she says, yes, I know. And he said, how do you know that? And so she had to come clean. She says, and he exploded at her. He said, how could you do that? And she said, well, sir, that's what you taught me to do. So yeah, in that case, there was, and she was able to do that. She was able to, get what she needed to do, get the job done, if you will. So the character works both ways.
Yeah. Another interesting common element to most of the stories is that they didn't talk about it very much after the war, which I think is very common after World War II.
I can't tell you how many times, again, this is my 5th or 6th World War II book, how many times I've gotten emails or calls even from family members who say, my father, my grandfather, he told you more than he ever told us. Mm-hmm. He never talked about it. And and I think there's, everybody had to handle it in their own way. And some of these guys and women too who saw that kind of action, they just wanted to come back and have a normal life. Mm-hmm. And they certainly weren't going to raise their kids with their war stories, And so a lot of those stories are, and what I worry about as an author, trying to recreate these trying to tell these stories, is if they're gone and they haven't told somebody or left anything in writing somewhere, that's lost. Mm-hmm. And I fear that a lot of those stories are lost. And as much digging as we might do, authors like me, we're not going to get to it if they're not around. And I really am going to I already am missing that generation and having them, to talk to. And that was really what drew me into my first World War II book. And then I thought, boy, this is great. And then, now 10 years later, I'm realizing they're all gone now pretty much. But as many as I can tell, as many of these stories as I can tell, I'm really dedicated to doing that. My only world #1 New York Times bestseller was a true crime story, as somebody told me. Crime pays, Bruce. But, I don't want to do those stories anymore. I don't want to write about murderers and serial killers, and I want to write these kinds of stories. That's my dedication.
Well, it's a great dedication, and in addition to that, I mean, we know we can't uncover all the details of history, et cetera, but you do, with the different individual stories, people can extrapolate. They know the big picture, and then they know individual picture, and they know that there's something in between that we can get a much better idea about what was really happening on the ground. Because people often talk about history and, well, there was this 10-year period. We don't have to talk about that. Nothing happened during that 10-year period. All kinds of things happened during that 10-year period that led to the next section. And so, as you squeeze down the data to the things that create a pattern that makes it look like everything is moving in one direction, you're skipping a bunch of stuff, because it never does that.
I would like to say something. One thing I'm asked is, how effective was the French resistance? And Eisenhower made the statement that the French resistance was equal to 5 extra divisions of infantrymen, or about 75,000 combatants in that. So once they hit Normandy, and that going across France, they had that much help. And after the war, in his own biography or autobiography, Eisenhower said that the resistance in France and other Western European countries shortened the war by 6 months. So they were effective, very effective.
You give, like you mentioned, that the Luftwaffe, even in the book, if I remember, that the Luftwaffe had to fight to keep control of the American airmen over the SS. If the SS wanted to take over, that they had to say, no, these are our guys. And I think it's an important part of the entire story in Western Europe, especially because we're having issues with Europe right now that we're talking about and stuff like that. And that is, there's always one group that agrees with, the new dictator. There's another group that is in between and just trying to live their own lives, and another group that's absolutely against it. And there's always people, even in the Nazi army, who were in favor of going by the Geneva Accords. And I think all of that, in spite of the fact that there were so many cruel people as well. And I think it's really important to understand that, because we see our own institutions, and we see some individuals behaving cruelly. And you can't just dismiss the entire institution based on that. You have to say, why was it organized that way to make that come out? Now, obviously, in Nazi Germany, it was intentionally designed to bring out the cruelty in people in order to be effective in subduing the population. So you have to keep that in mind. Is this intentionally being done, and what is that? But even so, the perspective of a continuum of different reactions is about the only way that we're going to get at reality, I think.
I had a feeling we were going to get to Socratic kind of questioning.
How come?
I really don't try to go into, I'm not a political scientist or a sociologist, or I try to stay in my lane and understand, what the folks I write about, I certainly want to know what their feelings and thoughts and motivations were, and in the context of their life then. And not all Germans were bad. But as one of the veterans said, enough of them were, we had to beat them.
So the question from Hollywood is, Audrey Hepburn was in the Dutch resistance, according to what people have said, that when she was a teenager. And so there were other things that went on. And the people who have written about that have said that it gave her a totally different sheen in life, a different attitude in life.
I bet.
That helped her get through what she did as an actress.
I bet.
Yeah. So, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.